NOAA ice core data proves climate changes. This presentation is for viewers that are knowledgeable and have experience in understanding graphs. A marine science department of a major state university invited scientists and local political officials to an advanced presentation on sea level rise. A NOAA official presented a PowerPoint graph of 420,000 years of ice core data showing 4 climate cycles. Please pause on and look carefully at each page in order to understand the information. The NOAA presenter pointed out lines showing CO2 rising and lines showing temperature rise following, saying, "This is proof that CO2 is causing global warming and consequently causes sea levels to rise." But stop. The NOAA official presented the graph from left to right. But in the lower left side of the graph, it states that time runs from right to left. The interpretation and presentation of the graph is backward. None of the scientists or political leaders in attendance commented on this backward interpretation. When questioned by a non-expert, the moderator said there was no time to talk about that. Let's reverse the graph to read it from left to right, as is proper. Here the graph is reversed to read from left to right. The graph shows 4 climate cycles over 420,000 years. Graph of CO2 showing the blue line, graph of temperature, the red line. Graphs shows CO2 and temperature rise and fall. 70 to 80% of the time of each cycle has been in glaciation, known as ice ages, and short warm periods. This is where it gets interesting. You see the climate cycles have slowed from 85,000 to 130,000 years. CO2 rose 5 times in the 420,000 years to about the same amplitude. Temperature rose 4 times over the past 3 cycles to about the same amplitude. But even though CO2 rose to about the same amplitude in all 4 cycles, including over the recent 12,000 to 10,000 years, however, temperature has stalled 7 degrees Fahrenheit lower than the past high temperatures. For a long-term perspective, the advent of modern man from cavemen only occurred over the past 20 to 15,000 years. Obviously, man had nothing to do with any of the rises of CO2 in the past high levels. This is a magnified segment of the past 20,000 years of the graph. Over the past 20,000 years, CO2 rose nearly 100 parts per million, as it did in all previous climate cycles. But for the past 12 to 10,000 years, average current temperature, the horizontal green line, has stalled 7 degrees lower than the past 4 temperature highs, which are shown at the red horizontal line. So even though man had no heavy industry prior to 1900, CO2 rose as it did in every previous cycle, but temperature did not rise as it did in any of the past cycles. Why? Clearly, rising CO2 does not force temperature to rise, nor does rising temperature cause CO2 to rise. Conclusion. NOAA said the ice core graph was factual proof that CO2 forced global rise of temperature and consequently the rise of sea levels. This is a false statement. Although the graph proves that there have been many climate cycles in the past, whereas the graph was presented backward by the experts, when presented correctly, the graph shows CO2 does not cause temperature to rise, nor vice versa. Lines beyond the border. After it was disclosed that NOAA's ice core graph was presented backward, this unsourced graph was found on the web showing time running left to right. Although the graph is presented left to right, the graph adds unusual lines of CO2, temperature, and CH4, methane, beyond the right border, and shows a great increase of CO2 of about 100 parts per million since 1900, the beginning of the industrial age. Even so, atmospheric temperature readings since 1900, as shown on this out beyond the border, have not risen to a level of any of the previous temperature highs. This raises other issues. The lines beyond the boundary lines are obviously not on the same scale as the scale of the ice core graph itself. 2. The source validity and indexing of atmospheric CO2 readings to ice core readings is questionable. 3. The source validity and indexing of atmospheric temperature readings is questionable. 4. Climate cycles are slowing. Why? 5. Are we at the end of a climate cycle? Why and what's next? 6. Why did the temperatures fall so fast after the warm high 240,000 years ago? Could it happen again? These issues will be discussed and evaluated in future BOSI research videos. Sources are noted here, but it is particularly important to realize that the data lines beyond the border are attributed to Wikimedia Commons. Wikimedia Commons represents itself as a free media repository, not a factual scientific source. Further investigations are important to continue. BOSI research seeks valid science to improve and maintain clean air, clean water, and clean earth, and to expose false science. For more details and questions, search bosiresearch.org. For contact, fax 252-222-1221. Please subscribe.